On November 1st, 1755, a city that thought it had conquered nature learned it hadn't. Lisbon was burning, not from conquest or siege, from the ground itself. At 9:40 in the morning, the Portuguese capital began to shake. 3 massive tremors in 10 minutes. Churches collapsed inward. The Terreiro do Paço, the Royal Plaza, fractured open. Fires spread through wooden buildings like they were paper. By noon, somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 people were dead in a city of roughly 275,000. One of the deadliest natural disasters in European history, and it happened to arrive at precisely the wrong moment, the height of the Enlightenment. Now, let me rewind. The 1750s were supposed to be different. Reason was winning. Science was winning. The old superstitions about divine punishment were supposed to be obsolete. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were teaching Europe that we could understand the world through logic, through observation. Natural disasters were becoming natural, explicable through physics, not theology. Lisbon seemed like proof that the old order was fading. Then the ground moved, and suddenly every intellectual certainty became a question mark. If reason governs nature, why does nature kill indiscriminately? Why the children in the churches? Why the innocent poor in the crowded quarters? Voltaire, who'd been championing the idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds, sat down and wrote something razor-sharp. Come now, examine the list of the dead. He was furious. He was terrified. This one earthquake cracked the philosophical foundation of an entire era. Before Lisbon, the Enlightenment had a certain optimism baked in, the belief that if we just think clearly enough, we can solve suffering. After Lisbon, thinkers split into camps. Some doubled down on reason. Others started wondering if maybe, just maybe, the world was less rational, less predictable, less controllable than we'd assumed. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The earthquake didn't just shake philosophy, it shook empires. Lisbon in 1755 wasn't some isolated European city. It was the nerve center of the Portuguese Empire, and Portugal at that moment was stretched across continents. Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, India, Timor. One tremor in the capital sent ripples through a global system. The Marquês de Pombal was the man who had to hold it together. Portugal's chief minister, essentially a dictator with enlightened intentions. And he faced a choice that no one had really faced before: rebuild the same city or rebuild it differently. He chose differently. He brought in engineers. He imposed a grid. He enforced building codes. He decided that Lisbon would be rational, geometrical, planned. What Pombal was really doing, though maybe he didn't articulate it this way, was proving that the Enlightenment could survive catastrophe, not by denying nature's power, but by using reason to rebuild. The new Lisbon became a living experiment in rational urbanism, and it worked. The city rose. The empire held. And suddenly, you had this visible proof that enlightened thinking could handle even the worst. Now, here's the irony, the one that museums love to highlight because it's so perfectly paradoxical. The earthquake nearly broke the Enlightenment's confidence, but Pombal's response actually strengthened it, because he showed that the tools of reason, engineering, planning, geometry could literally rebuild civilization. The very philosophy that the disaster had questioned became the solution. But the empire angle is where it gets darker. While Lisbon was being rebuilt with enlightened precision, Portugal's colonies were being milked harder than ever. The earthquake had damaged the economy. The rebuilding was expensive, and so the Portuguese crown squeezed its overseas territories more intensely. Brazilian gold, African labor, Indian spices, they all flowed faster into Lisbon to pay for reconstruction. The rational, enlightened rebuilding of Lisbon was built on the backs of people who had no voice in that rationality. Enslaved Africans, colonized populations. They didn't get a seat at Pombal's planning table. And so the earthquake, which had cracked one kind of certainty in Europe, only deepened another kind. The certainty that some people deserved exploitation. This is the part that doesn't usually make it into the standard Enlightenment progress narrative. The earthquake reshaped intellectual thought, absolutely, but it also accelerated colonial extraction. Reason and rationality became tools not just for understanding nature, but for justifying the expansion of European power. And here's what's really worth sitting with. The thinkers who were horrified by the earthquake's randomness, who questioned divine order, many of them also supported colonial ventures. They saw no contradiction, because they'd already divided the world into the rational Europe and the irrational everywhere else. The earthquake shook one certainty, but it didn't touch that one. The rebuilt Lisbon became a model. Other cities studied it. Urban planners across Europe took notes. Pombal's rational grid became the blueprint for how enlightened societies should organize themselves. And that's genuinely important. But it's important to know that the same rationality that rebuilt a city also rationalized the extraction of wealth from 3 continents. By 1800, Portugal's empire was actually larger than it had been before the earthquake. The colonies had been more ruthlessly developed. And the Enlightenment, that movement born from questioning certainty, had become, in many ways, the intellectual engine of European dominance. The earthquake didn't stop that. If anything, it accelerated it. So when you read about the Great Lisbon Earthquake in most histories, you'll hear how it challenged Enlightenment optimism, how it sparked philosophical debate, how it led to rational urban planning. All true. But you rarely hear the second half, that the same rational thinking that rebuilt Lisbon was being deployed to justify the systematic extraction of wealth from colonial territories. One catastrophe, two very different consequences. The earthquake itself lasted maybe 10 minutes. But its reverberations, philosophical, political, imperial, lasted centuries, and they're still worth understanding, because it shows us something we don't often see, how a single natural disaster can split into multiple histories depending on where you're standing. In Lisbon, it was a moment of enlightened rebuilding. In the colonies, it was a moment of intensified exploitation. Both true, both from the same tremor. That's the story that doesn't quite fit in the standard narratives. And it's the story that, once you see it, changes how you read everything else about the Enlightenment, about reason, about progress. The 1755 earthquake didn't just shake a city. It shook the entire architecture of how the modern world was being built. Subscribe. Each week, we uncover the hidden ironies buried in the stories you thought you already knew.